Since the first home console was released all the way back in the groovy days of 1972, there have been over 30 consoles created and sold in North America. That is an astonishingly high number. At this time, Nintendo was still years away from making their first console in Japan. Sony was still 20 years away from the launch of the original PlayStation, and Microsoft was 30 years away from the launch of the original Xbox. As you can see, times were much different back then. Remember Sega? Yeah, gaming has come a long way through the years. So I'm going to run through every single console generation by generation. It all began with the first generation of video game consoles, and North American gamers only really had one option at the time, the Magnavox Odyssey, which was released in 1972. The Odyssey had a really cool name and used a type of removable printed circuit board card, similar to a typical game cartridge, to play games. The console has that 1970s aesthetic and just fit right in back then. The games weren't too complicated on the Odyssey either. They consisted of 3 square dots and a line. You even had to put a plastic overlay on your screen sometimes to add additional visual elements to the games. Yeah, it was the first console ever, so I'm going to cut it some slack. Magnavox would go on to make more improved versions of the Odyssey until 1977, and etched their name into video game history forever. The second generation of video game consoles began in 1976 with the Fairchild Channel F. The F supposedly stood for fun, but I think it actually stood for flop. It wasn't the best console for hardcore gamers, but their education games for children were solid. 1977 saw the release of the famous Atari 2600, the console that is widely regarded as the king of the second generation. Its revolutionary joystick controller changed the game forever. Until 1977, you only saw joysticks in the arcade, but the Atari 2600 put one in your home. Along with Pac-Man, Space Invaders may be the most well-known game on the console and helped drive sales up. In 1978, we got the Bally Astrocade, which flopped. A year later, in 1979, we got the Magnavox Odyssey 2, an all-new console building upon the first one ever created, and it was actually pretty good. Lastly, in 1980, we got the Intellivision. It was Mattel's first video game console ever and actually gave the Atari 2600 a run for its money. The third generation of video game consoles, also known as the 8-bit era, kicked off in 1985 with, you guessed it, the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was Nintendo's first foray into the North American video game market after the crash of 1983. And oh boy, was it a smashing success. Their IPs like Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda were instant hits, and the games were unlike anything ever seen at the time. The controllers were simple, but way better than those from the second generation. The NES truly changed the game. Just a year later, in 1986, the Sega Master System and the Atari 7800 both hit store shelves to compete with the NES, but they came up short. The Master System had a much smaller library than the NES, and its games simply weren't as good. The Atari 7800 was a big improvement over the 2600, but still had its fair share of problems, especially in terms of audio. The fourth generation of video game consoles, better known as the 16-bit era, began in 1989 with the release of the TurboGrafx 16 and the Sega Genesis. The TurboGrafx 16 was technically not a 16-bit console, as it used a modified 8-bit CPU, which led to poor sales. The Sega Genesis holds a special place in my heart as it was the first home console I ever played. For starters, it was actually a 16-bit system, and all the Sonic the Hedgehog games absolutely slapped. It was such a good console with a great library of games, but still couldn't compete with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Released in 1991, the SNES was the king of the fourth generation. I don't even know where to start with the SNES. The NES was so successful that Nintendo just knew the SNES would dominate sales. Its graphics were great. It had some incredible games, and those controllers were top-notch. In fact, the SNES was so good, it was still popular well into the fifth generation. Oh, we also got the Neo Geo in 1991. It brought a unique arcade experience to your home, but it was so expensive that it was seen as a luxury console more than anything else. There were plenty of consoles released in the fifth generation, but only 2 of them had success in North America. 1993 saw the release of the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar. The 3DO had a highly promoted launch, but ended up a victim of market saturation. It was difficult to develop games for the Atari Jaguar, which led to poor sales due to a lack of third-party support. 1995 saw the release of the Sega Saturn, which failed to live up to the expectations set by the previous generation's Genesis. That's partly because it launched in May, A very odd time of the year, and because the console didn't release a single Sonic the Hedgehog title. After a dispute over a disc-based add-on for the SNES, Nintendo and Sony both parted ways and decided to do things on their own. Sony would go on to release the PlayStation in 1995, and Nintendo released the N64 a year later in 1996. This was the most intense console war we had ever seen at the time. Discs versus cartridges, traditional controllers versus funky controllers, fights over third-party developers, it had it all. The PlayStation was the new kid on the block and actually took it to Nintendo. Due to their usage of discs, they were able to steal some of their third-party developers from Nintendo, none more famous than Square Enix. The PS1 was the first console ever to sell over 100 million units, and was a smashing success. The N64 was also a very good console. Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, the N64 was loaded with great games, but at the end of the day, it couldn't compete with the PS1. The sixth generation saw 4 consoles duke it out for supremacy, starting with 1999's Sega Dreamcast, a console truly ahead of its time. The graphics on the console were insane for the time period, considering it came out near the end of the 64-bit era, and it had online capabilities. If Sega released it literally just a few years later, maybe things would have been different, but it was the last console they ever made. 2000 saw the release of the Sony PlayStation 2, which is still the best-selling console of all time today. For starters, the console was backwards compatible with the PS1, so there was no reason to not upgrade if you had the cash. It also doubled as a DVD player back when those were all the rage. Graphics were great, the controllers were great, and the console had online capabilities. It was everything any gamer wanted at the time. In 2001, 2 consoles were released, the Nintendo GameCube and the Microsoft Xbox. The GameCube was the first Nintendo home console to use discs, but they used mini-discs and not typical CD-ROMs. The GameCube had arguably the best controller of all time and tons of great games, but it failed to compete with the PS2. Microsoft decided to get into the video game scene with the Xbox, and it was very successful in North America, having a record-breaking launch and outselling the GameCube. Halo Combat Evolved was such a great game that players were buying an Xbox just to play it. Microsoft truly made online gaming go mainstream. The 7th generation of video games started in 2005 with the Microsoft Xbox 360. It was released a whole year before the PlayStation 3 and Wii, giving Microsoft a head start on the competition. The console featured Xbox Live, a revolutionary online service that helped you keep track of your friends and made playing online a breeze. While many believe the Xbox 360 was the king of the 7th generation, it was let down by technical issues, like the Red Ring of Death, time and time again. In 2006, Sony released the PlayStation 3 and Nintendo released the Wii. The PS3 was a direct competitor to the Xbox 360. The consoles both had an online service, and the main difference being the PlayStation Network was free while Xbox Live was a paid service. The PS3 also doubled as a Blu-ray player, which made it more attractive than the Xbox 360 at the time. While the Xbox 360 and PS3 were all about power and graphics, the Wii was all about innovation. The Wii didn't have gorgeous graphics or high-end specs, it was all about motion controls and having fun. They didn't get involved in any console wars, and it worked out well for them. The Wii outsold both of its competitors and is still being played to this day. The 8th generation of video game consoles kicked off in 2012 with the Wii U, which may have been Nintendo's biggest flop since the Virtual Boy. This console just didn't have it. It had a horrible advertising campaign, which led to poor sales right off the bat, and its gamepad was supposed to be revolutionary, but turned out to just be very limited. Its user interface and functionality weren't great, and, as usual, Nintendo lagged behind Sony and Microsoft in regards to its online service. 2013 saw the release of 2 consoles, the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Oh man, did Microsoft shoot themselves in the foot when launching the Xbox One. The console cost $100 more than the PS4 at launch because it came with Kinect, which, oh yeah, was always on, watching your every move. It didn't go over well with the public, so many gamers switched to the PS4. Both consoles were great, but it's clear that the PS4 was the class of the generation, until the Nintendo Switch came out in 2017. It took Nintendo 5 years to learn from their mistakes, but they took everything that was innovative about the Wii U and perfected it in the Switch. It was the first hybrid console, capable of being played in handheld mode or in docked mode. It's revolutionary and one of the best consoles available right now. Lastly, we have the current generation of video game consoles, the 9th generation. In the span of 3 days, we saw 2 new consoles get released in 2020, with the Xbox Series X and S and the PlayStation 5. As you know, the Xbox Series X is the most powerful console in the world, capable of playing games in 8K at 120 frames per second. It has one of the most modern controllers out there with a gorgeous hybrid D-pad, and is just chock full of next-gen features. Its little brother, the Xbox Series S, isn't nearly as powerful as the Series X, but it's still capable of playing games in 1440p at 120 frames per second, so it's intended for those who don't want to pay up for all the bells and whistles. We also got the PlayStation 5. It has similar specs to the Xbox Series X, but has a little less raw power. Instead, Sony focused mostly on the solid-state drive. The PS5's SSD is much faster than the Series X's, which cuts down on loading times substantially, improving the gameplay experience for everyone. It's also got a more futuristic design than the Series X, if that's what you're into, as well as a controller chock full of unique features. It would be great if these consoles ever became available in stores though. I feel like I've been waiting forever to buy one. I'm not gonna lie, I wish I started my gaming adventure all the way back in 1972 with the first console ever. But wait, now that I think about it, wouldn't that make me a middle-aged man today? You know what? On second thought, I'm okay with the way things are.